All right. So we've talked about history. Now let's begin our journey in the history of Christianity. We will spend the rest of today's lecture a little bit about Jesus, but believe it or not, we're going to spend most of our time talking about Jesus's followers. Because really, if history is interested language, if history is about the lens through which one is reporting an event, then the history of Christianity doesn't start with Jesus. It starts with his followers, right? Who begin to recount his life. We need to, quote unquote, meet these early followers of Jesus. We need to meet these people by looking at the world in which they lived. We need to see how these first disciples took the information, and I don't mean necessarily just the disciples who walked with him. I'm talking about those who were the early Christian community. How did they take this information about this man from Galilee and turn it into founding principles of a world religion? I want you to first try to envision in your mind the ancient world in which Jesus lived. Jesus was from the land of Judea. Judea was what's called an occupied territory. Jesus came on the scene during the time of the Roman Empire. You could say one of the prominent times of the Roman Empire. Whenever we see a dramatization of Jesus, or his life, his ministry, I always kind of smirk because they create this world, inside view, right? That makes Judea seem like it was huge and vast. In your textbook, I think it's on page 20 in your textbook, there's a map that shows you the size of the Roman Empire in comparison to this occupied land, insignificant occupied land in which Jesus was born. One of the interesting things about the Roman Empire was that even though at the time, at that point in history, it was the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, it occupied various countries. Despite this, its power and its size, the Roman Empire, when they occupied a territory, they allowed the territory to maintain their own cultures, maintain their own centers of influence. These occupied territories were allowed to do business as normal. Their politics, their religion, you can do what you do. The only thing Rome did is to ensure its presence by having a garrison of troops there and requiring that these occupied territories pay a tribute. This was unique for the Roman Empire because prior to the Roman Empire, most countries, when they became occupied territories, they were conquered. Means they lost their own autonomy. They lost their independence. And those countries relied on whatever the conquering world power was to protect them from enemies. At the same time, and this was actually true with Rome as well, if you are an occupied territory by Rome, and you have smaller countries on the outside of that territory, do you think those smaller countries on the outside of that territory would attempt to come in and occupy you? No, because you're occupied by the Roman Empire. So it was kind of a pro and con situation, right? You're occupied territory, so you lost some autonomy, you lost some independence, you had to pay a tribute, but at the same time, you're a little protected because the person on the outside is not gonna mess with you because you're occupied by Rome. And Rome came with a little bit more political stability. Individuals in an occupied territory had the opportunity to become Roman citizens. Either you became a Roman citizen by doing certain duties, such as joining the military. If you were a slave or a house servant, you could be given citizenship by being freed by your master. Or just the old-fashioned way, if you had money, you could pay for citizenship. Again, these are some of the benefits, quote unquote, benefits of being occupied by Rome. Why was citizenship such a big deal? If you were a citizen, there were certain taxes you were free from having to pay. You could not be prosecuted by the local authorities. You had to be taken before a Roman court. And also, as a Roman citizen, you had access to educational and social influence that actually began with Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. So if you picture the land, or during the time of Jesus, you have the land of Judea, a small province, occupied by Rome. And with Rome comes this very heavy Greek culture. It's called Hellenism. Hellenism. Hellenism permeated throughout any territory that the Roman Empire occupied. Greek was the language of all business. It was language of the literate. And it was the common, I guess what you call the universal language, meaning, to give you an example, a lot of you probably don't watch it, but when I watched it as a child, it was huge. I guess it's trying to make a comeback. But the franchise, the Star Trek franchise, they had what was called a universal translator, because they come across all these different aliens and all these different beings, and conveniently, I guess the universal language is English. Didn't know that, right? So in the interstellar world, English is the standard language, and English is the universal language. That is the case back then. What the universal language was Greek. Everybody may have had their own tongue, but Greek is what was used universally, right, to conduct business and for educational purposes. Therefore, the people of Judea were familiar with Greek culture. Even prior to Jesus, so we're talking about we'll say 2 centuries before Jesus. The land of Judea fell under control of the Greek Empire. It was actually called the Seleucid Empire because Seleucid was one of the generals that took over a quarter of the Greek Empire after Alexander the Great died. And so for over a century, Judea was exposed to Greek culture because Hellenism was sweeping its way through Judea. During that time, the Jews, who historically were very protective of their identity, had to make a determination. Do we accept it or do we reject it? Some greatly embraced Greek culture. Some rejected it because they were concerned about losing their own identity. About a century and a half before Jesus, there was a Seleucid ruler, Greek ruler, who ordered and mandated all the lands that he occupied to follow a Greek culture. This includes the land of Judea. This is significant. This included the mandate that no young men can be circumcised as prescribed by Jewish law. And then he put a garrison of Greek soldiers in Judea. And the worst thing he did, well, again, from the view of the Jewish people, is he began to convert the temple to a worship space for the Greek gods. As a result, the Jewish people, under the leadership of a specific family called the Maccabees, revolted against the Greek Empire. And they actually drove the Greeks out of Jerusalem, including cleansing the temple. They took all the Greek gods, engraven images out of the temple, and they rededicated the temple. Matter of fact, that's where Hanukkah comes from, the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, even though they drove out the Greek images out of the temple, the Maccabees, their family, their dynasty, which ruled for quite some time, could not stop Greek culture from spreading. So Greek culture continued to spread throughout Jerusalem. Once Rome came in and occupied Judea, they conquered the Maccabees family and placed their own selected Jewish king to rule Judea. And these kings were supervised by governors, like who eventually become famous, Pontius Pilate. And he's only famous for one reason, because he ordered Jesus to death. Why did I go through this history? Again, I want to create the world in which Christianity is seen. So you have a time when Jesus comes on the scene. They're occupied by the Roman Empire. Right? Small province, not a lot of wealth, Roman soldiers walking up and down in the areas. Of people who are considered of no importance whatsoever. They're just an occupied territory in the way, all right? They're constantly being occupied. First it was by the Greeks, then they revolted. They were able to maintain their independence for a little bit, but really when the next big world empire came through, they just got occupied again. And this is a people who historically, they were promised what? According to their faith, independence. That they would have their own nation. Right? You have all these prophecies about them having their own nation, that their nation would be the be a blessing to all other nations. Right? So you have a people who, according to their tradition, they were supposed to have independence promised to them, ordained to them by God, yet they're continually to be occupied. In other words, part of their tradition is this tension with higher authority. Now, in our nation, when I say tradition or I say faith, and today it's considered a private matter. But whatever you, this is the consensus is whatever you do for faith, that's a private matter. That's not something that affects the public sphere. Right? There's a separation between the church and the state. However, in the time of Jesus, who you worshiped was very public, and it had a direct connection to your political allegiance. Stated another way, your worship practices demonstrated who you politically were aligned with. Specifically in the Roman Empire, worshiping the gods, the Roman gods, and the emperor himself was considered a civic duty. In other words, you can have all your indigenous faith traditions, but you have to include the worship of the Greek gods and the emperor. And because worship was very public, when you walked into any metropolitan area, you would see different faith traditions literally worshiping side by side with each other. Today, if we drive down the street, there's a Methodist church, there's a Presbyterian church, there's a Catholic church, there's a mosque. We have buildings where you worship separate from each other. In Jesus' time, you would walk into the public sphere and people would be worshiping whatever tradition they had in the open. You would find people worshiping Roman gods. You would find people worshiping Greek gods because Greek culture was still there. You would find people, especially in Judea because of where it was located, you would find people worshiping Syrian gods, Egyptian gods, etc. It was a melting pot. Most of these, now remember, this is before Christianity. Or I should say, this is before Christianity was recognized as its own tradition. Most of these religions, those indigenous to Judea, would call them mystery religions. So you have the Roman gods, the Greek gods, the Syrian gods, the Egyptian gods. They would refer to them as mystery religions. Because these mystery religions were so foreign to the Jewish understanding, relationship with God, conception of God, and the Jewish tradition. And even though these mystery religions were different in a lot of aspects, I want you to take note of what they held universally between them. Each of these mystery religions, first of all, they focused on a God who somehow, in some way, defeated death. Either their God experienced death and was reborn, or their God went into the underworld and came back alive. It's the first thing. So on all these mystery religions, whoever their God was, defeated death in some way. The second thing about these mystery religions, all of the mystery religions, this was the mysterious part. in order to be part of the religion, you were given special, we'll say, actions that initiated you into the faith. You were given practices and actions that not only initiated you into the faith, but it also, if practiced, gave you the ability to share in their God's ability to overcome death. So we've got, in all the mystery religions, a God who overcame death. We've got initiation practices that brought specific initiation practices that brought you into the faith. And if you continue these practices, you would share in their God's ability to overcome death. And lastly, in all of these mystery religions, you were promised that after death, you would be reunited in an idyllic setting with their God. Does any of this sound familiar? It's no wonder that when Christianity began and followers began to talk about Jesus, what would persons think? That Christianity was no different than the other mystery religions of the time. Initially. And if you think those universal principles are something, I'm going to tell you specifically, I want you to make note specifically about the followers of a Persian god, Mithra. This Persian religion, who wants to guess how the person was initiated into the faith? What action do you think they had to do? When I say it, y'all gonna be like, wow. The initiation, they had to be baptized. Water immersion. That's how you were initiated into the faith. What was a common practice for followers of Mithra? They shared a common meal. At least once a week. And guess what the common meal was? Bread and wine. Guess what Mithra's birthday is? Take a wild guess. Who thinks they may know what Mithra's birthday is? December 25th is Mithra's birthday. If all that sounds familiar, do you understand why those outside of Judaism would see Christianity as simply a mystery religion? And I say outside of Judaism because, this is important, early on, Christianity was seen as a sect within Judaism. It wasn't seen separate. It was simply seen as a group within Judaism. Because quite frankly, all the early Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. Now, this might seem odd. But in Jesus's day, Judaism was not one monolithic I want to say, there was not a monolithic Jew, right? Even in Judaism, there was a spectrum of Judaism. And there, or I should say, there's a spectrum of groups that came together within Judaism based upon their interpretation of Jewish law, their understanding of who the Messiah was, and quite frankly, their relationship with the Roman Empire. For this course, I want you to be familiar with 4 of these groups. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. First, let's talk about the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the upper class. Which one? This? Yeah, Essenes. It's an E. Essenes. The Sadducees were the upper class. They were very powerful politically and very wealthy. The Sadducees saw the temple as the center of Jewish life, of Jewish religious life, the temple. This is because the Sadducees were the priestly class, and priests were assigned to the temple. Okay. Historically, there were 12 tribes of Israel. The tribe of Levi was the tribe that was responsible for the temple. Well, first the tabernacle and then the temple. When the Israelites first got to the promised land, and it was divided up amongst the tribes, the Levites did not get any land. Why? Because their responsibility was the temple. And all the tribes would take that's where tithe comes from. They would take 1/10 of what they had and give to the Levites for the temple. The Sadducees, this group, are descendants of the Levites. Now, human nature. If all you guys are given land to work and till and put your labor to, and then you got to give me 1/10 of what y'all have, and then centuries go by, am I ever going to tell something? No, I'm pretty much expecting what y'all doing, right? What's going on with your land, right? After centuries, is it going to be a little bit of tension? Because I got all the money, but I'm not putting any labor in, and I'm responsible for the most important asset of our people. All right? Very powerful, very wealthy. And they felt obviously that the temple was the center of religious life. Why? Because that's where they had their power of influence. That's what their responsibility was for. Another thing I want you to know about the Sadducees, they believed that God's inerrant word, so God's word was only the Torah. The Torah being the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. All the other writings and the oral tradition had no spiritual authority, only the Torah. And the Sadducees had a very good relationship with Rome. They had a good relationship with Rome, and they embraced Greek culture. Because as long as Rome was happy, remember I told you, Rome allowed communities to continue whatever centers of influence they had in the countries that they occupied. So as long as Rome was happy, the Sadducees were, we good. No one's gonna make us move as long as Rome is happy. All right. So they had a good relationship with Rome. Don't misunderstand me. They wanted their independence, but not if it had to come by upsetting Rome. Okay. The next group, and I would say probably the most famous in the stories or the accounts of Jesus, are the Pharisees. The Pharisees would be the middle class. Which, by the way, when I say upper class, middle class, and I talk about these other groups, remember the time period we're in, we'll talk about men. Very patriarchal society. Okay. At this point in history, women have no political, I didn't do it, so don't look at me. I'm just saying women didn't have any political or social influence at this time. So when we're saying this, we're talking men. Middle class, they felt not the temple, but adherence to the law. So the actual Mosaic law was the center of Jewish life. Temple was important, but it was adherence to the law that was most important. They followed a strict adherence to the law. Unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed that God's word included the Torah, I'll put it this way, it included all scriptures, not just the Torah, and the oral tradition. What do I mean by oral tradition? Written interpretation of the scriptures by the various religious leaders. It's called the Talmud. Talmud. And they were very skeptical of Greek culture. Why were they skeptical of Greek culture? Because Greek culture pulled you away from the law. So you have a different relationship with Greek culture between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees embraced Greek culture, had great relationship with Rome. The Pharisees were skeptical of Greek culture and really did not have a good relationship with Rome. Okay. The Zealots. The Zealots were composed of middle class and lower class. And the Zealots outright actively rebelled against Rome. They actively rebelled against Rome. They participated in what we would call today guerrilla warfare. They knew that, yes.
Sorry. But, about the Sadducees and the Jewish law, was that, were they like strictly following it like the Pharisees, or were they more lax about it?
They strictly followed it when it related to the temple, but not in everyday life. Because they did not think that most of the law, the application of the law is found in the oral tradition, which they didn't see as having any spiritual authority. But if the law pertained for them directly to the temple, then they followed it to a T. Good question. The Zealots, they participated today what we would call guerrilla warfare, meaning they knew they didn't have the power, at this point in history anyway, to completely run Rome out of Judea, but they felt if we do enough strategic attacks, maybe they'll just get tired of us and leave. That's what guerrilla warfare is. When you just kind of keep hitting to the point where the power, even though they're more powerful, is like, I'm tired of putting resources into this pain in the butt people who have no significance whatsoever. Let's just leave. That's what the Zealots were, actively rebelling against Rome. Which obviously means they had an extreme dislike of Rome. They wanted them out. The Zealots also felt that anybody who collaborated with Rome, i.e. the Sadducees, were also a problem. And the last group are the Essenes. The Essenes were a monastic group. Meaning they withdrew from society and lived on the outskirts of the city, outside the walls of the city, out in the desert and wilderness areas of Judea. Like the Pharisees, they believed in strict adherence to the law. They also wanted Rome out. but not by active rebellion. They believed, well, to an extent, all of these groups believed this, right? But the Essenes felt that eventually a Messiah would come, or Savior would come to deliver them from Rome. This is the wide range of groups of Jews that existed during the time of Jesus. Now, not all Jews identified with, like, fell directly in line with one of these groups. In fact, most Jews just quite simply was trying to make it through the day. However, you do have these groups that existed in the community. No doubt you found someone, they may not have felt direct. It's much like us today, right? There's a lot of us, I mean, it's a little bit different. It's not exactly the same because we really only have a two-party system in this country. But there's a lot of us who, when you guys are getting to that age, when it comes around election time or political talk, you find yourself like, okay, I can see that point. I can see that point too, right? And that's how most people live. Yeah, I see what the zealous is doing. I ain't doing it, but I see what they're doing, right? I can get behind, what the Pharisees is saying, but most people kind of fail somewhere within all of these groups. The point is, you have these groups vying for people's support in the community. And walking among this group is Jesus and his buddies, his entourage, his friends. What makes up the story of Jesus is his interaction and his friends' interactions with these groups. And quite frankly, his interaction with these groups is eventually what led to his death. Some members of what was called the Sanhedrin, the high local court among the Jews, was made up primarily of Sadducees, who remember wanted a good relationship with Rome. This group feared that Jesus' followers would try to proclaim him the Messiah, the king who would overthrow Rome. That's a problem if they want to have a good relationship with Rome. So they denounced Jesus a traitor, and eventually taking him to the Roman governor, Pilate, who quite simply, again, when we look at dramatizations of Jesus, they make it seem like the entire world was taking note of Jesus's interaction with Pontius Pilate. And quite frankly, when he came before Pontius Pilate was simply doing what he did on a regular basis, and that is a troublemaker is brought in front of him. He's Jewish, he's not a Roman citizen, just kill him. A lot of times with the reenactments of Jesus's mission and execution, the Jews are portrayed as responsible for Jesus's death. However, I want to point out the Gospels make it very clear that only a small number of Jews, those in the Sadducees, a very small number of even them, participated in denouncing Jesus. It's clear who killed Jesus. Pontius Pilate of Rome. And he did it without giving much of a thought. Like I said, I hate to break it to you, but the world did not stand still when Jesus died. At that moment, to me, that actually makes it a more powerful moment. But Jesus was just one of thousands of Jewish men who were crucified under the rule of Rome. What was significant was something that neither Rome nor the Jews who were enemies of Jesus expected. And that was, once Jesus died, what they expected to happen is that the movement would be over. But the exact opposite took place. Rather than disappearing, when Jesus died, this movement actually increased. The people that gathered around Jesus before his death continued to believe in him after his death. And his message grew even larger with him not there. That's the most significant, well, barring his death and resurrection, that's the most significant effect historically of Jesus' death. The Christian church actually increased. It didn't go away like every other leader once they perished in history. Now, it's easy for us, particularly if you are a believer, to read the Gospels 2,000 years out of the culture they were written and look at Jesus' teachings and his miracles and to say, wow, he was really something. How could you possibly not believe him? But in reality, at the time of Jesus' ministry, he was not the only one doing miracles. He was not the only one giving prophecies. He was not the only one interpreting the law. There were other charismatic teachers and miracle workers during Jesus' day. In fact, Jesus would have been seen at the time as one in common. He would have felt in common with the group of the Pharisees. Jesus, like the Pharisees, saw the law as vital to Jewish life. He valued temple sacrifices, concerned about the way people live their lives. Yet at the same time, there was something unique about his message. He thought the Torah was sacred, thought the following the law was the way to get closer to God, but he went a little bit further. To Jesus, the law could be summed up to loving God and neighbor. He said this was the essence of the Torah, the essence of Judaism, and the essence of what he wanted people to know. As Jesus was walking through Judea, teaching, healing, and telling stories, he gathered around him, I'll be honest with you, more than 12 people. But the most famous of his followers are the 12 disciples. Now, I'm not saying the 12 disciples did not exist. However, what I am saying is it is significant. You're going to hear me say this several times, that there are 12 disciples. I told you how many tribes were there? 12. Okay. So the number 12 has a significance when you're retelling the accounts. So there were 12 disciples. I'm telling you right now, there will be a question on the exam about listing the 12 disciples. It's going to be extra credit, but you're going to have to list the 12 disciples. The easiest way to memorize the 12 apostles, we'll say, or disciples, is first, I'm going to tell you, first, get the brothers all together. Right? You had James and John, two brothers. You had Peter and Andrew. You got two sets of brothers. That's four right there. Everybody should, well, I should say everybody, but most of us know the name of the disciple who betrayed him. That's Judas Iscariot. So that's 5. And everybody knows the one who doubted him, which was Thomas. So that's 6 right off the bat. Get the brothers together, the one who betrayed him, and the one who didn't believe that he was resurrected. That's half of it. The rest you have to memorize, but you can kind of put their jobs with them. Matthew was a tax collector. You have Simon, Philip. There's another James, and Thaddeus and Bartholomew. You just got to memorize those. When you think about these 12 apostles and their importance in church history, it's amazing who these people were. None of them were wealthy. They were all working class people, with one exception. Some believe Matthew was actually, as a tax collector, he has money. They certainly were not perfect by any means. They argued all the time. The leader of the group, Peter, while he was loyal, he was also stubborn and, quite frankly, said some stupid things. In addition to, as I mentioned, in addition to these 12 disciples or 12 apostles, though they are rarely mentioned, it is evident and clear in the gospel that Jesus had many women who were also his significant followers. The two most significant was obviously his mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary. But arguably the next most famous female follower of Jesus was Mary Magdalene. Who, quite frankly, and this is actually, we're going to talk about this Thursday, is the only disciple mentioned that witnessed I shouldn't say witnessed, but was present at the tomb of Jesus' resurrection in every account. During Jesus' lifetime, those who gathered around him were simply called his followers or disciples. After his death, they were referred to as those who followed the way, but they were not called Christians. It wouldn't be until a decade after his death that they will be called Christians, and they did not give themselves this name. It actually was the Gentiles or the Roman government who gave them the name Christians. This is significant in the history of Christianity, being given the name Christian, because unlike other faith traditions, which were identified by Christian, being called a Christian is more than just identifying a group. When you say, I am a Christian, or when they say, I am a Christian, they are not just identifying what group they belong to, but they're actually making a proclamation of what they believe. In other words, unlike other faith traditions, so if you are for example, a Buddhist, the connection is to the Buddha, right? As the founder of the faith, of the tradition. If you are Jewish, you're connected with an ethnicity. You're not called Jesus's, right? I don't even know how you make that Jesus's or whatever, right? You're called Christians. because it's not founded upon the identification. This is significant about, tells us something about the early Christians. It's not about the man Jesus from Nazareth that they were identified as. They're identified as a group who believed that that man from Galilee was Christ.